Well, welcome everyone. My name is Galen Barbos. I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, joined here by my colleagues Sunhee Baik and Cheska Miller. And we are happy to welcome you all to today's webinar, where we will share some of the results from a recent study of ours, looking at how customers with behind-the-meter solar and storage can kind of manage some of the trade-offs associated with how they use those systems and kind of balance the competing uses between maximizing their bill savings and maximizing the value of these systems as a backup power resource during power interruptions. Before getting into the presentation, let me just go over the standard set of housekeeping items. So first, this webinar is being recorded. And we'll be posting a copy of the recording along with the webinar slides. You can see a little QR code on the title page here. That is where you can find a copy of the report, and that is also where we'll be posting the webinar recording and slides in the next day or so. So please check that out. And then the other little bit of housekeeping is to just mention in advance that we will have some time for Q&A at the end. You should all hopefully see a Q&A box somewhere in your webinar console. So please, as we proceed through the presentation, enter your questions into the Q&A box. Cheska will be getting those organized and queued up in time for the Q&A session at the end. And hopefully we'll have at least 10 or 15 minutes for that. So with that, let's begin. So the project here, this is the third and final in a project in a series of 3 studies that we've conducted over the past couple of years, looking at the role of behind-the-meter solar and storage and providing backup power. Really, the motivation for all of this work is that we see increasing levels of adoption of behind-the-meter solar and storage systems. That's being driven really by a whole variety of different factors, but chief among those are the opportunity for increased bill savings, as well as the demand for backup power. The work that we've done in the past has really focused mostly on backup power applications in the context of long-duration power interruptions. These are typically associated with extreme weather events and often come with some advance warning where customers can charge up their batteries in advance. Many power interruptions, in fact, are quite unpredictable and come without any advance notice. And to maintain readiness to respond to these kinds of events, customers typically are able to set their battery to maintain some sort of minimum amount of capacity in reserve in case of an unexpected power interruption. Now that comes with a trade-off. The higher the reserve setting, obviously, the greater the customer's ability to weather a potential outage, the greater the reliability value. But then the less capacity is available for day-to-day bill management. And so that you can think about as an opportunity cost. And so in essence, really what this study is about is really kind of looking at that trade-off, looking at how both the bill savings and the reliability value change as customers adjust their reserve setting, and trying to understand for any given customer and set of circumstances what makes sense in terms of how to kind of maximize the combined value of both the bill savings and the backup power value. So we do this through a modeling-based study. We'll talk more about the different modeling tools in a few slides, but I just want to stress that this is not an empirical investigation, but this is all based on model results. And one key feature of this modeling structure is that we stochastically simulate power interruption events. And we do that using a tool called Presto, which Berkeley Lab developed, and that I'll talk about further in a couple slides. The other key elements of the project, we focus on single-family residential buildings. We look at a variety of different locations with a diversity of climates and geographies. The power interruptions are based on kind of historical data. So there's this kind of an empirical aspect to them, and they include a mix of both short and long duration events. The tariff structures, the retail electricity rate structures that we consider here are really kind of based on a standardized, somewhat stylized set of structures. And the PV and storage configurations are similarly standardized across the different locations, just to allow us to kind of compare apples to apples across these different locations. And the overall analysis, it's structured as a scenario analysis. So we have a base case, which I'll define, and then a sense of sensitivities that allow us to explore changes to some of the key base case assumptions. Within the report, we have a longer list of caveats. I'll just highlight two of those here. The first is that this analysis really is predicated on the interruptions occurring without any forewarning. To the extent that customers can anticipate a power interruption and charge up their battery in advance, then the reserve setting really kind of becomes moot. And so this analysis really doesn't apply in those sorts of situations, but rather applies specifically to sort of unpredictable power interruptions. I'd also just clarify that this is not a cost effectiveness evaluation. We're not looking at the cost of investing in storage, nor are we looking comprehensively at the full suite of different benefits, but rather we're really just focusing on these two different benefit streams, the bill savings and the reliability value, and looking at the trade-offs associated between those two as they relate to this reserve level setting. So with that, let me talk a little bit about the data and methods. We obviously have quite a bit more detail in the report, but I'll try to cover the key pieces here. So we look at 10 different locations, and specifically we look at 10 counties across the US, each of which encompasses a major metropolitan area identified on the map here. And these 10 counties span all of the different climate zones throughout the US. By selecting these different locations, we're capturing locational differences in loads by virtue of the climatic differences and differences in building stock characteristics. We're capturing differences in solar generation across these locations and differences in interruption patterns that are typical in each of these 10 locations. As I mentioned, though, the tariff structures, these are kind of standardized tariff structures. We're not looking at the specific tariffs that are currently in place in these locations. The building load data, this comes from NREL's ResStock building simulation platform. ResStock develops statistically representative sets of building models for each county in the US. For each of our 10 counties, we select the median customer, and that's what we use for the base case analysis. And then we've got some sensitivity analyses where we look at the 20th and 80th percentile customers in each county. The load profiles for each of those are shown here. The PV systems are sized to meet 100% of the customer's annual energy consumption, subject to available roof area. We use NREL's system advisor model, SAM, to simulate hourly generation from each PV system. And of course, this is all synced up to the same weather data that we use for the load profiles. The power interruption event, so this is a little bit more dense, but this is an important feature of the analysis, so warrants a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, we used the Presto model, which we developed here in-house, to generate stochastic simulations of power interruption events in each of our study locations. Specifically, we ran the model to produce 1,500 simulated years for each location. Presto, we trained this model using historical hourly interruption data for each county in the US. And specifically, we used data from the years 2017 through 2021. And so because the model was trained on that specific historical period, the interruption profiles for each of those locations reflect the interruption patterns over that particular historical time frame. And so that's why you see in some locations particularly long average interruption durations. Dallas, Fort Worth, and LA we've highlighted, or in the case of Phoenix, relatively frequent average interruptions. And so I just want to be clear that these simulated interruption profiles, they don't necessarily reflect long-term historical patterns, nor, of course, do they reflect projected future patterns. And so we should think about these 10 different locations and interruption profiles that we've developed is really just reflecting a diversity of different interruption patterns. And I would urge you not to ascribe too much significance to the specific locations here, but really just to think about these as reflecting a kind of a diversity of different interruption profiles. The tariff structures, so these are important because in the end we have to model both kind of backup power performance and also bill savings. The tariff structures, we considered two basic tariff structures. Net billing, and so net billing, for those that aren't familiar, is a kind of a tariff structure where solar generation that is exported to the grid gets compensated at something less than retail rates. And then the other tariff structure we considered is kind of typical net metering, but with time of use rates. And so under both of these structures, storage generates bill savings by arbitraging between high and low prices. In the case of the net billing tariffs, it's arbitraging between import and export prices. For the TOU rates, it's arbitraging between peak and off-peak prices. But that is basically, that's the mechanism through which the bill savings from storage occurs. Now, the storage dispatch is also impacted by the grid charging and discharging constraints. And our default assumption is that the storage, battery storage, it charges only from surplus solar generation, and it discharges only to meet net load. And so that's what we assume in the case of the net billing. But for the different net metering TOU structures, we have basically 4 different variants that correspond to the 4 different permutations of either allowing or not allowing grid charging and grid discharging. And so you can see those listed in the table here. TOU self-consumption is the term that we use to refer to the case where there's neither grid charging nor grid discharging allowed. There's then a case where we allow grid charging but not discharging, the converse, and then finally what we call TOU front of meter, which means that we allow both grid charging and discharging. And so the terms used in this table are going to recur throughout the presentation. And so hopefully these are intuitive enough that you'll know what we're referring to when you see these terms pop up in some of the later results. And so here, just to give a kind of a concrete sense of why these tariff structures matter and how they impact some of the results, here we show some illustrative dispatch profiles for 2 of the tariff structures and 2 different storage reserve levels. And so the 2 figures on the top, so we show dispatch profiles for net billing and for the TOU self-consumption rate. And if you look at the figures on the top where we have a relatively low storage reserve level, just 5%, you can see that storage for both of these structures charges from excess solar during the morning hours. That's shown in the blue shaded area. And then it discharges in the late afternoon and evening hours after solar drops off. That's shown in orange. So that's similar between the 2 structures, but the difference really relates to the extent and the depth of the discharge. Under net billing, storage really just continues discharging down until you get to that minimum storage reserve setting. In contrast, under the TOU self-consumption tariff, you can see that the storage only discharges partially, really until the end of the peak period. and at which point the state of charge in the battery is still pretty high, well above the minimum storage reserve level. And so this distinction in terms of the depth of discharge comes up later in the results and it drives some of the differences that we'll see later on. And then the figures on the bottom show just what happens where you set a really high storage reserve level. And so obviously there, in both cases, you're not discharging the battery very much. So with that, let's turn to the results. And the way that we've kind of structured the results here is we're first going to just walk through the base case results for a single location, for Memphis. And we didn't choose Memphis for any grand reason other than that it was sort of middle of the pack in terms of some of the kind of underlying drivers. But what we're going to do is we're just going to walk through, first show how the bill savings change as we ratchet up the reserve level. We'll then do the same thing showing how the reliability value changes as we ratchet up the reserve level, and then put those two things together to show how the total customer value, which is the sum of the bill savings and the reliability value, changes as we increase the reserve levels. So here, this is just a ton of information. You don't need to absorb it all, but we wanted to just lay out in one place kind of the key base case assumptions highlighted or circled in red here. And really, I'll just really draw your attention to a couple of those numbers. The first is what we call the price arbitrage differential. So we're assuming just a 5-cent difference between either peak and off-peak prices for the TOU rates or between import and export prices for the net billing tariff. And that's a really small differential. And we did that deliberately because we had some reason to suspect going into this analysis that the bill savings were going to kind of dominate the results. And so we wanted to kind of stack the deck, so to speak, in favor of the reliability savings by starting with some base case assumptions that would kind of depress the bill savings as much as possible, and then explore what happens with higher price differentials through the sensitivity cases. So we're starting with pretty small price differential. The other base case assumption that I'll note here is the value of lost load, which we're assuming is $5 per kilowatt hour. This metric, the vol, is really refers to kind of how much would a customer pay to avoid a kilowatt hour of interrupted consumption. And there's a whole literature out there behind how to estimate customer value of lost load. Our $5 per kilowatt hour assumption is very much informed by that literature, but suffice to say there's quite a bit of variation out there. And so that's why one of the sensitivities that we'll feature looks at what happens when we change that number there. So to start out here, we show what happens to the bill savings from storage as we increase the reserve level. So the bill savings are shown along the y-axis, and to be clear, this is just the incremental bill savings from the storage, not from the PV system. And then along the x-axis, we show reserve level as a percentage number. That's, you can think about as the percentage of the usable capacity of the battery. And so as we would expect, the bill savings decline as you ratchet up the reserve level, basically removing some portion of the battery from availability for day-to-day price arbitrage. That decline is steepest for net billing and for those TOU rates that allow grid discharging. And in those cases, the bill savings decline more or less linearly with the reserve level. In contrast, for the TOU cases without grid discharging, so those are the bottom two lines, you can see kind of this more concave shape where the bill savings kind of change gradually up until a reserve level of, say, about 40%, and then decline more rapidly thereafter. And the reason for that shape really goes back to that time series chart we were looking at before, where we saw that, there's, a pretty substantial portion of the battery capacity that really doesn't get used for day-to-day kind of bill savings price arbitrage. And that's because there's no grid discharging allowed and kind of a limited amount of load to serve during the peak period. And so that's why we see kind of a different shape for those rate structures. So here's the same sort of thing, but looking at what happens to the average annual reliability value as we change the reserve level. And the lines here are surprisingly flat. The reliability value doesn't really change that much with the reserve level. And within the report, we unpack this a little bit further, but basically it comes down to the three factors listed here. The first is that there just aren't that many power interruptions, and those that occur tend to be relatively short. And so there's just not that much interrupted load to serve. Number two is that PV meets a lot of that interrupted load. And so the amount that is then left to be served by whatever initial state of charge existed on the battery at the beginning of the interruption, there's just not that much load left to serve. And so that initial state of charge on the battery ends up being less important. And then thirdly, depending on the tariff structure, the initial state of charge on the battery at the beginning of the interruption is often quite high, even if the reserve level is very low. And you can imagine, particularly in the case of tariff structures that allow or incentivize grid charging, in those cases, the battery is going to be sitting around most of the time at a pretty high state of charge, even if the minimum reserve level is much lower. And so for tariffs like that, the reserve level just isn't going to matter as much anyway. So now putting it all together, we show the total customer value. So this is the sum of the bill savings plus the reserve level. Given that the bill savings decline with reserves, whereas the reliability level is flat, it should come as no surprise that the sum of those two things more or less mirrors the results that we saw for the bill savings and declines with reserves. And in other words, customers tend to be better off maintaining low levels of reserves because the opportunity cost of increasing their reserves in terms of foregone bill savings more than offsets any gain in reliability value. Of course, with some of these tariff structures, the change is relatively modest, up to, in this case, about a 40% reserve level. So, customers under certain tariff structures might be relatively indifferent up until some point, but beyond that point, certainly increasing the reserves will tend to reduce the overall value to the customer. So that was for Memphis. What about the other 9 locations? And we're going to show the results here, and I'm going to focus just on our 2 kind of bookend tariff structures, the net billing case and the TOU self-consumption case. This first figure here is a bit of a mess. It kind of looks like a bunch of spaghetti just thrown on the page. But basically what we're showing is for each of the 10 locations, how does the total customer value, that is the sum of the bill savings plus the reliability value, change as you increase the reserve level. And I can save you the effort and the eye strain and just tell you that basically across the board, the trends are the same as what we saw for Memphis. The lines may be shifted vertically along the y-axis, but they all have a downward slope and all suggest that customers are better off maintaining as low a reserve level as they're allowed to do. Now, as I mentioned way back in the methodology section, this whole analysis is built on a stochastic representation of power interruption events, where for each of these locations we ran, we have 1,500 simulation years, and we ran this analysis over each of those years. The lines here show just kind of the average, the annual average value. They don't show what is happening in, for example, a worse than average year. To sort of look at those stochastic results and kind of the distribution and results across all of those simulation years, we need to kind of change the format of the results a little bit. And so just to make things clear and hopefully avoid confusion, let me explain what we're going to do here. So the figure on the left is kind of a stylized line diagram like what we were looking at before, where we see how the total customer value changes as you increase the reserve level. And in this case, that value declines with increasing reserves. What we're going to do is we're going to translate that line into a single data point that we plot in the bar chart on the right-hand side. And specifically, what we're going to plot is the change in that total customer value as you increase the reserves from 20% to 80%. We just chose 20% and 80% sort of arbitrarily, but so as to not pick the absolute extremes, but kind of something close to either end. So, basically this shows what happens to total customer value as you increase reserve levels. In this case, customer value declines, and so the bar chart on the right-hand side is negative. This allows a more kind of compact figure structure. It also allows us to overlay the error bands, which are shown by this kind of vertical line, if you can see my cursor moving here. And those error bands just show the range across the 1,500 stochastic simulation years. And that allows us to see, for example, what happens in a worse than average year. So here we show the base case results across all 10 study locations for the two different bookend tariff structures. The bar segments show really what's happening in our average. On average, this is the same as what we saw a couple slides ago with the spaghetti chart. But really the incremental piece that I want to highlight here is these error bands. And these allow us to see what's happening in worse than average years. And those worse than average years are basically the tops of those error bands. And what you can see is that in general, even under worse than average interruption years, still the customers tend to be better off maintaining lower reserve levels. There is sort of a modest exception here in the case of Seattle with the TOU self-consumption rate. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you like. But as a general matter, really the bottom line here is even under worse than average years, the results and the findings that we highlighted before continue to hold. That is, customers are better off maintaining low reserves. So this is all for the base case results. We ran a whole bunch of sensitivity cases. I'm not going to cover them all in the webinar here, but I do want to go over some where at least we see some change in the overall results and the kind of the storyline. So as I mentioned, the Presto model that we used was tuned to historical interruption data for each of the study locations, and really therefore reflects kind of average interruption frequency within each of those counties. But we can dial that metric up or down, and in particular we can dial it up here to see what happens if interruption frequency is higher than kind of historical averages for each of these locations. We can also look at what happens if you increase the value of lost load to the customer, and those two things together are going to tend to kind of push things in the direction of reliability value and potentially allow us to see under what circumstances would it make sense for a customer to raise the reserve level. We're also going to then look at what happens if you increase the pricing differential rather than assuming that very modest 5 cent per kilowatt hour differential that we assumed in the base case. In the report, we've got a whole bunch of other sensitivities, battery size, building load, kind of the base tariff price. We won't cover those here, but I wanted to just mention that those results do exist in the main report. So what are we going to do here? So first, we're going to start with our Memphis case again, and we're going to apply progressively higher interruption frequencies. That's this SAFE term, and higher value of lost load assumptions, starting with the net billing structure. And so the bar charts here kind of follow the same format as what we were just looking at a couple slides ago, just kind of turned on their side so that it's easier to read. So the base case results here show that increasing the reserves from 20 to 80% decreases the customer value. And this is what we saw before. Now, what happens if we double the interruption frequency? That number is still negative. What happens if we double the value of lost load? Still negative. What happens if we do both together? Still negative. What happens if we 10x the interruption frequency? So 10 times as frequent the power interruptions is in the base case. Still negative. 10 times the value of lost load? Still negative. Only when we 10x both the interruption frequency and the value of lost load does the sign flip, and we see a situation where the customer is better off raising their reserve level. So this is for the net billing tariff structure. These results in the bottom part of the figure are also for the kind of 10x interruption frequency and value of lost load, but showing what happens for the other rate structures. And in general, the results there are less pronounced. In the case of these bottom two tariffs, the self-consumption and grid discharging tariffs, the results, they do flip positive, but they're smaller. For these other two tariffs, they don't even flip positive. So this is Memphis. What about the other locations? So here we show kind of a subset of these the results from the previous slide, but for all 10 locations. So in dark gray, we show the base case results. So this is results that we've already seen. In the light gray, we show what happens when we double both the SAFE and the vol. And then in yellow, we show what happens when we 10x both the SAFE and the vol. And across all 10 locations, you can see that merely doubling the SAFE and the vol doesn't really move the needle. Still, the change in customer value from increasing the reserves remains negative. In basically all 10 locations, if you 10x the value, the results do flip. And in some cases, flip quite dramatically. So here's Memphis, which we were looking at on the last slide. And you can see, at the most extreme end of the spectrum is Phoenix, where the results flip quite dramatically. And that reflects both the higher frequency of power interruptions in the base case, as well as larger loads and therefore larger amounts of loads that can be served during those interruptions. Now, all of this, I'll remind you, still is assuming that very modest 5-cent pricing differential. And so, we have stacked the deck as heavily as possible in the favor of reliability value here by not only 10xing the interruption frequency and value of lost load, but retaining this very modest pricing differential. What happens if we now layer on the higher pricing differentials that are perhaps more representative of what we might see under a typical net billing or TOU rate? So we do that here. So all of this is built on the net billing case with 10x SAFE and 10x vol. And all that we're doing is then kind of incrementally increasing that pricing differential from the 5 cents in the base case to 10, 15, and then finally 20 cents. So you could argue for going even further than 20 cents, but we've stopped the analysis here at 20 cents. And you can see, as we would expect, that as you increase that price differential, you reduce that kind of benefit from increasing the reserve level. In effect, you're increasing the opportunity cost of raising the reserves. In some of the locations, raising that pricing differential up to 20 cents is enough to flip the results back into negative territory. So back to kind of similar to what we were seeing in the base case. In other study locations, even at 20 cents, you can see that customers with relatively extreme interruption frequencies and values of lost load still might prefer to set their reserve levels high, even with that kind of higher opportunity cost. So it very much differs depending on the location. So that's pretty much it in terms of the results. I'll offer just a few quick concluding thoughts, and then hopefully we can get through as many of your questions as possible. So just first, maybe to kind of boil down the results into a few key takeaways. Across all of the study locations, we found that the reliability value, that is the backup power value to the customer, is surprisingly insensitive to the reserve level. And in the report, we talk about some of the reasons why that is. But because of that, the opportunity costs of maintaining higher reserves tend to outweigh any gains in reliability value. And as a result, customers are usually better off maintaining as low a reserve level as is allowed by the battery manufacturer or otherwise. And that finding is pretty robust across all of the different tariff structures that we evaluated, and across most of the sensitivity analyses we considered, many of which we did not cover in the webinar today. There are, however, a limited set of circumstances where raising the reserve setting does increase the total customer value. And specifically, that occurs when for customers who reside in locations with exceptionally poor reliability, and where the customer has exceptionally high value of lost load, and where the customer is on a net billing rate or is on a TOU rate that allows grid discharging but not grid charging, and depending on the location, the price differential on that rate is relatively modest. So as you can tell, this is a pretty stringent set of circumstances in which a customer might find it advantageous to raise their reserve level. But nevertheless, this combination of circumstances can and does exist. And so in conclusion, bill savings and reliability value are both important parts of the overall value for a customer who is investing in a solar plus storage system. But as we found, bill savings tend to be more sensitive to the reserve level, and therefore in most circumstances justify maintaining as low a reserve level setting as is allowed. Of course, as I mentioned, circumstances of any individual customer matter, and so it's important to take those into consideration. The tariff and the interconnection rules also matter and can impact how customers make this trade-off. I would say specifically those rules related to grid charging and grid discharging can make a very big difference. And then one thing which we didn't really talk about in the webinar, other than perhaps sort of obliquely, is that technological advancements can also impact how customers make this trade-off. And one of the specific things we're referring to there is, some battery systems come equipped with features that can predict when outages occur. I think Storm Watch is the name that one of the manufacturers give to this feature. And to the extent that the battery systems can predict when outages occur, that of course lessens the value to the customer of setting a higher reserve level and impacts the way that they make this trade-off. So with that, let's conclude. Hopefully we've got some good questions queued up. We've got about almost 20 minutes left for Q&A. Maybe before handing things over to Cheska, who will run through the questions, I'll just flip to the QR code here. Again, this is where you can find the report and is where we will post the webinar recording. And with that, Cheska, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Thanks, Galen. Well, I think I'll probably be handing the mic back over to you right away. So I think one question was just asking if you could explain the rationale behind using a time of use front of the meter as one of the cases that we model. And furthermore, is that a common rate for residential customers? Which I think that second question is maybe a little more outside of what we looked at.
Yeah. So that's a good question, and in the flurry of the presentation, I probably glossed over that a little bit too quickly. But just to be clear, we are not technically modeling the system as front of meter. It's still behind the meter, but it's behaving as though it were in front of the meter. And we say that because we're allowing grid charging and grid discharging. And so it is essentially, under the TOU case, just simply arbitraging between peak and off-peak TOU prices, completely independent of the customer load or the solar generation. And so it's like how a battery would operate if it were installed in front of the meter. But in fact, it has to be behind the meter if it's going to provide backup power to the customer. So it is actually behind the meter. It's just is behaving as though it were in front of the meter.
Great. Yeah. And maybe a similar question to this is we had a question about how our analysis is looking at the value in terms of kilowatt hours, so the kind of on a dollar per kilowatt hours basis. And they just had this question about if we're looking at load reduction in terms of kilowatts and how that might affect our results. And I think just to say, like, take the first crack at this is we're looking at residential systems here, and generally residential customers don't really have a dollar per kilowatt pricing besides basically demand response programs. And so that was something we didn't really take into consideration. Yeah, I don't know, Galen, did you want to add to that at all?
No, I think that's right. I agree.
Okay, great. There was just one question asking if you could kind of talk a little bit more about that outlier Seattle case in a little more detail, kind of why we saw those differences.
Yep, sure. Let me flip that back to that here. So what we found here, just to refresh my memory, if not the rest of you, is that for Seattle, under the TOU self-consumption tariff, first of all, even in sort of an average year, we're seeing that the total customer value is pretty flat across reserve levels. And in a worse than average year, the total customer value actually increases a little bit with reserves. And I think really the main reason for that is that the bill savings are just really small in Seattle. And the reason for that is that it's cloudy. There's not a lot of solar generation. And so by increasing the reserves, the opportunity cost in terms of foregone bill savings just is much more slight, because you're just starting from a much smaller base of bill savings. I think that is probably the main driver, though there could be some other factors at play there as well.
Great, thanks. I think related to reserve level, there's this question just about if we have any insight about how a customer might decide what reserve level is appropriate. Um, is that based on an installer's recommendation? Is that something that's flexible? I think that's something we didn't really cover in this research, but I don't know, Galen, if you have any insight on that you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting kind of empirical question about how customers in the real world actually make these decisions. Um, I don't know, but I would guess that the vast majority of customers um, have no idea what their reserve level is, and probably the installers just set things up with some default, and that's where it remains. Um, but I think, and so I think part of the purpose of this analysis is just to generate a little bit more awareness, and to hopefully inspire both customers and also installers to be deliberate, and to maybe engage in a discussion around what reserve level really makes sense, and what the trade-offs are, and what those trade-offs look like, kind of given that customer's particular circumstances.
Great. It looks like we have a few more questions coming in. Um, okay, we had another question about reserve levels, more about an aggregator. I think that's sort of, you covered a little bit of that. Oh, here's a good question for you. Do you see different seasonal results in regions such as New England that experience winter storms, whereas in the summer, the need for battery reserves or risk of outages is typically less?
Um, So, in the end, everything got rolled up into annual numbers. So we didn't sort of break out the results seasonally. We do actually show in the appendix, and let me see if I can elegantly bring us to these results. Here we go. So here we show just the distribution in the timing of interruptions by season for each location. Um, and so you can see that, well, it varies a little bit, but, in some locations, you can see that the interruptions are much more highly concentrated in winter months. In other places, they're more highly concentrated in summer months. Well, it really varies from location to location. Um, and so certainly that impacts the results, and sort of how the timing of the interruptions might coincide with changes in seasonal energy usage. At least, for Boston, which is, one of the cold weather regions, it actually looks like interruptions during the winter months were relatively infrequent, and most of the interruptions tended to happen during kind of more temperate spring months. But I think that's, definitely an important issue, definitely impacts some of the differences in the kind of the magnitudes of the results that we see when comparing across regions. But it's not something that we really kind of unpacked in any detail.
Great, thanks. We have another question here that I think is a little bit less relevant to what we looked at, but just wondering if the analysis provides enough comparison to show how solar with storage might benefit a customer over using natural gas as a backup generator.
Yeah, no, that's definitely beyond the scope of this analysis. Yeah, as I sort of mentioned at the outset, this is not a cost effectiveness evaluation. And so, yeah, to do that kind of comparison really requires taking into consideration both the relative costs of these systems, as well as the benefits and the differences in performance level. And that's outside the scope of our work, though I do know that others, NREL, I believe, has looked at that, has published some work kind of comparing the kind of reliability of solar plus storage as a backup power resource to conventional fossil-based backup systems.
Great. Sorry, there's some of these questions coming in that I haven't looked at quite yet. Just an earlier question about if we have any plans to look at this on maybe a commercial and industrial level, just to kind of look at this for other type of customers and how that sort of the business case or the value might be different.
We don't have any plans, but we would certainly be interested in doing that. Yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned at the beginning, this report here is really the kind of the final installment in a series of reports that we produced under kind of a 3-year project. That project is basically winding down, and we don't have anything in the hopper that would continue this line of research, but certainly we would be interested in doing that. And I think looking into commercial customers would be one of the priorities there.
Yeah, great. I also see 2 questions here that are kind of just asking about if we have any tools available or any resources that can kind of help customers or maybe even developers sort of inform sizing for system value. I think this could be a good time to kind of talk about Presto briefly, or just anything else that maybe comes to mind, Galen.
Yeah, so I mean, to mention Presto quickly, I mean, that model, as I mentioned, is something that we developed at Berkeley Lab, and really is a tool that is used to simulate the occurrence of power interruptions based on kind of historical patterns in each county. And so I think for our analysis and other analyses, that can be used as kind of part of the inputs to an analysis if you wanted to kind of generate a realistic representation of kind of when and how long power interruptions tend to occur in any region, which then in turn can kind of help to inform some sizing decisions. I think that really the standard, I mean, there are some standard tools out there that developers might use to size their systems. NREL has the REOPS tool, some of you may be familiar with. There are other commercially available tools out there as well. And those tools, I would say typically, do a good job of capturing kind of the bill savings benefits and figuring out how to optimally size a system to kind of maximize those benefits. The representation of kind of power interruptions is sometimes not quite as well defined, but not quite as granular. But I think that's an area where a lot of development is starting to take place.
Yeah. There's this other question about how we determined the size of each battery, and say for this report we used a standard 10 kilowatt-hour battery for these results, but in our year 2 research project we actually focused more on specifically sizing the battery.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, here we focused, for the base case we assumed a 10 kilowatt-hour battery. We looked at a sensitivity with a 30 kilowatt-hour battery as well, which really kind of didn't change things much. But yeah, I think, I mean, what we see in the market today is, most residential systems out there are, installing, the equivalent of what would be, either 1 or 2 Tesla Powerwalls or some other model out there. So somewhere in the range of, 10 to, perhaps 25, 30 kilowatt hours is kind of the typical range that we see. And at the higher end of that range, that's often, customers, larger customers, and also customers that are really interested in being able to have backup power over a multi-day outage. And that, as Cheska was saying in our year 2 study, is really kind of what we focused on and looked at how you would size a battery if you wanted to be able to ride through multi-day power interruption, and kind of how that changes as customers electrify their homes, and as other changes to the building stock occur.
Thanks. And we have a question maybe a little bit related to this. Is it a fair takeaway in California under NEM 3.0 that it only makes sense to add batteries to reduce your bill unless the number of outages in your area is much higher than expected? And I think this is a question basically about just sort of that price differential. And maybe we could just talk about this more broadly about how we sort of looked at these different export prices within our study and sort of took that into consideration when thinking about sort of optimal sizing for customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think to that specific question, I want to be clear that nothing in this analysis says anything about whether or not a customer should install a battery. Okay? This is all about if you have a battery, how do you set the reserves? Do you set them low or do you set them high? That's the question that we address here. We're not doing a cost effectiveness evaluation. We're not assessing whether or not investing in a battery makes sense. So that's really outside the scope of this work.
Thanks. Let me see if anything. Let's see, there's a question here. What about the other extreme of small battery and short demand response events instead of major outages? Is still minimizing reserves the best customers can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that scenario of small batteries and short interruptions is kind of what we looked at here. I mean, it's true it was a mix of short and long, but most of the interruptions were relatively short, talking, on the order of, hours, not days. I think in general, the shorter the interruption, the more that tilts the balance towards lower reserves. So I think focusing exclusively on short duration events or even shorter duration events than what we considered, that would only kind of further, sort of amplify the findings, or the findings would be even more pronounced in that kind of scenario.
Thanks. We have a few more questions here, but I think generally a few things, like you said, we're not doing a full kind of cost analysis. And so I think some of these questions are sort of looking for that, but that's something that we don't cover here. We have a question about if the results are based on sort of customer preferences and sociological, where I think, what we're doing here is looking more at just modeling a large range of reserve levels and things like that. So we kind of don't take that into account.
That's right. And I think just being mindful of the time here, we are at the top of the hour now. So I think we should probably bid all of you farewell. Apologize if we weren't able to get to your questions, but certainly feel free to shoot us an email. Happy to answer questions or receive any of your comments offline here. Again, I just wanted to leave you with the QR code for the report, and thank you all again for joining us today. Hopefully this was useful and you learned something. And of course, feel free again to reach out to us if you have anything further you'd like to ask about. Thanks a bunch. Bye-bye.
Thanks.